Ambassador Thomas Stelzer is the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. He was appointed to his current position by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in February 2008. Previous to this position, Dr. Stelzer served as permanent representative of Austria to the United Nations, International Atomic Energy Agency, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization Preparatory Commission. Dr. Stelzer has also served on a number of diplomatic and international positions, including, but not limited to, Deputy Director of the Austrian Cultural Institute in New York, where he really was practicing culture diplomacy directly, delegate to the Committee for Disarmament and International Security of the General Assembly, and representative to the UNDP, UNICEF, and UNFPA. In 2008, Dr. Stelzer co-negotiated the second conference of states parties of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, where he serves as vice chair. Ambassador Stelzer also holds a doctorate degree in law from Vienna University, a Master of Arts in Latin American Studies from Stanford University, and a diploma from the International Relations from Johns Hopkins University. If you could please join me in a very warm welcome for Ambassador Stelzer. Thank you. Good to see you, my friend. Welcome.
Thanks for your generous introduction, which makes me aware that I'm not that young anymore. And also calling me still an ambassador. I'm not an ambassador anymore, but we say once an ambassador, always an ambassador. But I'm now working for the United Nations. I'm not representing a country anymore. And it's great to work for the United Nations. And I think it's a very good idea to discuss culture diplomacy at the premises of the United Nations, because somehow this is what we're doing here all the time. You know, United Nations' comparative advantage is its incredible convening power. It provides a platform for 194 member states to come together and to discuss interests. In fact, what we're doing here is we try to identify overlap of interests. That's what's happening here. In every issue, you know, countries express themselves, informing others, stating what is in their interest, and this overlap of interest that we can identify is what we call a consensus. And progress in the United Nations is enlarging the consensus. So how do you do that, a larger consensus, and to come to real results? This is real cultural diplomacy. We do this in many different ways. You know, the two pillars of our work here, in fact, I would identify and focus down on is advocacy and capacity building. Advocacy is something you might be aware of, that is helping players understand what is in their own interest. And capacity building is enabling them to implement results that have been achieved in this cooperative, comprehensive, slow, but continuous way in the United Nations. What are these results? There are resolutions, there are conventions, there are principles which all agree upon. And very often, you know, these results are dead wood because they cannot be implemented. Either member states don't have the capacity to do that, or just may I give you, let's do it a little bit practical, since we're here and you might, you know, you can read the theories in books. But since you're here, you might be interested, how is the work happening at the United Nations? To give you an example, you mentioned this, this convention on corruption, AntiCorruption Convention. You know, anti-corruption is a big issue globally. You know, according to World Bank reports, every year between $2 to $3 trillion are siphoned out of economies to corruption into private pockets. So this money is not used to a large extent in a constructive way. It doesn't really yield results in our efforts of economic and social development. In Southeast Asia alone, it's about $300 million a year. $300 billion a year, sorry, which is siphoned out to corruption. So corruption is really a structural impediment to development because this money is lost. So how do you fight corruption? No. In the United Nations, we got together when we identify the issue. Whenever you want to do something in the United Nations, you have to get an agreement on what is the issue. Because there's so many issues that we cannot deal with all of them at the same time. So issues, you know, have a short life in the United Nations, and they're pushed upon us by our member states. We do only what our member states give us a mandate for. You know, so a lot of issues we don't have a mandate for. Member states need to give us a mandate. We have a lot of mandates, more than we can handle. But the member states give us the mandate. And mandates we get for issues which are too big to be handled on a national, regional basis. The global issues, issues without a passport, issues to be too big to be handled by one country. And normally it takes quite some time until countries recognize that the issue is too big for them. Because whenever we get a mandate, that means countries give up part of the sovereignty to the United Nations and ask us to handle an issue. So corruption is one of these issues. You know, after decades and decades, finally we agreed that corruption is a big issue. It's big enough for the United Nations. And member states decided that we're going to work on an anti-corruption convention, which we did. And we negotiated that in Vienna, and I was one of the negotiators. In fact, I led the negotiations on the implementation chapter. But the most significant chapter of this convention is Chapter 5, which, and this is what I want to use as an example now for advocacy and also for capacity building. Chapter 5 deals with repatriating resources which have been appropriated through corruption and invested in assets abroad. You know, one of these many, there's so many examples for this, but you always quote, in previous times, some of these kleptocrats who have stolen from their people and then invested the assets in Swiss bank accounts, British bank accounts, anywhere. Abasha, we were able to locate $4 billion in British bank accounts. It was easy to locate it, but there was no means to get the money back into where it belonged to. And for the first time, this Convention on Corruption provides us with legal provisions to get this money back. So there's a huge interest involved. Even if this money is frozen, $4 billion is still a big chunk of money. And as long as it is part of the economic circle in the country, it yields results. So to get this money back, you need sound provisions. And this convention provides exactly the provisions to get the money back. Now that's pretty good. Now, so we have to make now advocacy now in this context means making countries aware what the convention provides to them, the new opportunities to get this money back. Now we have very little experience on this issue because it hasn't happened in the past. So how do we enable the judiciary in a country to really go and fight a big country which has ratified the convention to get the money back? This is capacity building. So the United Nations is trying to pool all the knowledge, all the expertise, and make it available to all those who will use it, to the lawyers, to the judiciary in a country like Nigeria. So they are able to root this convention in the national legislation and to really inhale life into these provisions and to make it successful. So this is what we do. Advocacy and capacity building are two pillars. And this is reflected in all the work we do in the United Nations. So when the 194 get together and we identify an overlap of interest on any of the issues, like in corruption, or right now one of the big topics is, of course, climate change, integration of economic social development. We try to push this overlap and try to enlarge the consensus in very small steps and to yield real results. Now, cultural diplomacy, is quite an old issue. It was extremely relevant, of course, during the time of the Cold War, when there was a real strong division of cultures, and when there was no MTV and there was no globalization as such. Things have changed very much in the meantime, of course. But still, books are written like The Clash of Civilizations, which we view very critically. Because at the United Nations, we are pragmatic. We try to achieve things. And for that, we have to bring all the actors together. And the secret to gain consensus is to build ownership. So it is not enough to have a theoretical consensus also on an issue. It only works if in the process to build this consensus, you buy every actor in. So everybody recognizes that he or she or the country has something at stake in the process. So you build a shared ownership in the outcome, which also helps them to implement what has been achieved. Because if ownership is not strong enough, we forget what we have achieved, and these results become dead wood, as happened in so many places. So building of ownership among all the actors, among all the cultures, of all the diverse interests reflected by 194 countries in this intergovernmental organization is a huge challenge. And that's not enough now, because we have recognized finally, after having provided a platform for governments for many decades, you have seen that in the General Assembly when the leaders come and they make big proclamations. We have recognized that we have come to terms with the fact that the preamble of the United Nations does not refer to we the governments of the world, but we the peoples of the world, which goes far beyond the governments, of course. So we are, and the Secretary General emphasizes this at every opportunity, reaching out to all the stakeholders now. So that's quite an innovative approach, but it is very important. So we are not exclusively dealing with governments. Mainly, yes, because we are an intergovernmental organization. But at the same time, we are conscientiously and initially reaching out to all the stakeholders, which is beyond governments, of course, civil society. Governments are normally sort of limited to these 4 or 5 year electoral cycles. Civil society doesn't have these limitations. So the big issues in civil society have a much longer time dimension, which helps very much. And then the question is, of course, who holds whom accountable? Who holds governments accountable to really do what they have promised at the elections? It has to be the electorate, civil society. So our way of trying, this is one of our big issues, is accountability at the United Nations. How do we hold people accountable? We have so many promises here. If all the promises that have been committed here in this building were implemented, our world would look much, much different and much better. But unfortunately, they are not, because the representatives come to New York and then they don't get carried away, but they understand what is the issue, what's the shared interest. They commit to things, then they return to their countries and they get soaked up in their daily issues. And unless they are held accountable by their own stakeholders, they will not continue implementing what they have promised to. And this gap between commitment and compliance with commitments is one of the big issues we have been dealing here. So the outreach to civil society, to all the stakeholders, also to academia, and also private business, of course, increasingly in the Global Compact, in all these different partnerships we're doing here. That all, of course, includes bringing thoughts, cultures, interests together to forge this common understanding, anti-ownership. Now, what are the real tools in the United Nations to deal with these cultural differences and to bring people together? Well, one of them, of course, was the Millennium Declaration of 2000, which clearly recognized that a culture of peace and dialogue among all civilizations should be actively promoted. And the formulation was, we acknowledge the diversity of the world and recognize that all cultures and civilizations contribute to the enrichment of humankind. We emphasize the importance of culture for development and its contribution to the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. What the MDGs are, the Millennium Development Goals, I think you all know. They are the backbone of our work here. Much of the press we get is from the Security Council. But of course, much of the sustained impact the United Nations has is happening somewhere else, in the field of economic and social development, where we have long-lasting contributions. So this is something we must not neglect. And the Secretary General, in his proclamation recently to the member states on his action agenda for his second term, the Secretary General just started his second term on the 1st of January, second 5-year term. And the centerpiece of his second term is sustainable development. Because he believes, and we believe, that this is where the United Nations can make the biggest input. Sustainable development. Inclusive development. What does this mean? Don't leave anybody out. Try to really provide opportunities for everybody, globally. What does opportunities mean in today's world? Opportunity in today's world is very much decent work. In our world, unless you have a decent job, it is very difficult to take your own fate into your own hands. Unless you have a job which is predictable, rights-based, secure, you cannot invest in the future, in a house, in a family. You cannot really take your own life into your own hand. So decent work is maybe the most important part of enabling people to take their own fate into their own hand. But it's the biggest challenge. A decent job is our biggest challenge. And this is what we try to overcome right now in what we are concentrating on here Rio Plus 20. So you might have heard about Rio Plus 20. Some of you might have heard about it. You know, the Secretary General has said, and I totally believe in that, and I use every opportunity to repeat that, the Rio Plus 20 is the most important conference of our generation. And this is it's going to happen in 5 months in Rio. You know, 20 years after the Earth Summit in '92, the world is coming together again, looking into what has happened since '92 in regards to sustainable development, and to see what are the new challenges we have to face, and what are the challenges we need to develop strategies for to meet them. And what are the challenges? The challenges are what the Secretary General calls the 50-50-50 general. 50-50-50. That means in the year 2050, there will be 50% more people living in this world than 10 years ago. And at the same time, we need to lower CO2 emissions by 50% to stay within the famous 2 degrees Earth warming, to keep this world sustainable. This is the big challenge. But that's the easy thing. You know, while we are adding 1 billion people to this globe every 15 years, you know, has been 130 years from first to the 2nd billion. It has been less than 30 years from the 2nd to the 3rd billion. But now we have leveled off. Then it became much, much quicker. You know, the curve really raised. And now we have leveled off, and we're adding about 1 billion every 15 years. We just added 1 billion to the 7 billion. So there are 7 billion people living here. And most likely, it's very difficult to make predictions in population issues because so many factors are involved. But we have been adding 1 billion every 15 years, and we will be adding that. That means we have to create jobs for 70 million people every year who are pushing into the labor markets. 70 million a year, just to keep the balance. Now we have lost 80 million jobs in the economic and social crisis. That means in the next 5 years we have to create globally 400 million jobs just to stay where we are. And the situation that we are in is not very good, as we all know, because job and the lack of jobs is one of the big issues. And it is not only a philosophical issue, this is really a political issue. Because if you look at what has happened in North Africa in the last year, you know, huge unemployment, especially among young people, educated young people, who had lost their faith in the states and in their optimism in the future because they had been excluded from the processes, because nobody had been able to create jobs for them. And you know, at a certain point, you know, if there's no future and no hope and no vision, people lose their faith in the state, and national structures crumble. The social contract falls apart. This is what's been happening in Tunisia, in other countries, Egypt. And this is what's happening right now in other parts of the world too. I mean, you all look at what's happening in Greece right now, what has happened in Beaulieu in France. You know, we have nearly 50% youth unemployment now in Spain. We have about 40% in Ireland. We have about 40% in Italy, in Slovakia. Youth unemployment. I mean, these are huge, huge numbers. So creating work for these people who are added every year to this world. You know, I don't want to shock you with you. Many of you know these things anyway. But the population of sub-Saharan African cities will double in the next 10 years. That's the prediction. You know, if you look at cities like Nairobi today, with an average age of 25 years and 75% unemployment, you know, if these cities double in the next 10 years, you can imagine what the challenges are for all of us at the United Nations in the lead function. By the way, you know, I'm not saying urbanization is bad, not at all, because in fact, many of the social services that are provided in cities could not be provided in the countryside. So bringing people and people moving to urban centers also provides with huge opportunities to extend social services, of which most people globally don't participate in. You know, we just published a report in the United Nations on social services, and out of the 7 billion people living on this world, more than 5 billion have no access to any kind of social services. No security, no access to any social services. Nobody protecting them from the uncertainties of life. 5 billion people. You know, so urbanization is one of the big, sustainable urbanization is one of the big themes of Rio +20. So with this billion people, you know, the lowering of CO2 emissions by 50%, you know, it's an is in fact a huge challenge. But the issue is how do we raise productivity, and we need growth, you know, to integrate the 1 billion people extra every 15 years to provide work and opportunities for them. Not only opportunities to survive, but to grow and to take their life into their own hands. So this is what we are facing in 5 months in Rio. And every input from your side will be extremely welcomed to help us resolve these issues. You know, we have identified 7 large priority areas that we need to concentrate on here and bring the work together. One is, of course, combating poverty, you know, which is the big issue, because we still have a huge number of people in this world living with the famous now it's $1.25 a day. But how do you fight poverty? You know, how do you create an economy which reduces social inequality, provides economic opportunities, and at the same time secures the resources that we live, is sustainable? How do you integrate the economic, the social, and the environmental aspect into our future economies? You know, how do you increase growth on long term, but at the same time reduce CO2 emissions? You know, which there's no consensus, but a very large agreement that we have to do that to stay within the 2%, the 2 degrees warming, which is too much for many people and for many experts already anyway. You know, so this is just a very arbitrary consensus, the 2 degrees. So how do you do that? You know, how do you provide food security? You know, today 1 billion people go to bed hungry every day. 80% of global agriculture is not irrigated. Slightest changes in rain patterns caused by climate change will have unquantifiable impact on food production. Water issues, you know, water management. If we continue using water as we have done in the past, by 2030, we'll have a gap between demand and supply of 40% globally. So unless we totally rethink our water management, wastewater management, you know, we are washing cars with drinking water today. You know, we are taking. Expensive. Yeah, I mean, it's just not sustainable. You know, we are pulling out water, you know, million-years-old water to wash our cars with, or to flush our toilets with. You know, or another question in the context of poverty eradication. You know, if you look at a country like China, which have made huge progress in poverty eradication, you know, and bringing in China 10% of the population out of poverty is a few 100 million people. You know, if a few 100 million people start taking showers twice a day, you know, as we are accustomed to it in the United States, you know, what impact does this have on the water situation in a water-stressed environment already anyway? So. Energy access. You know, how do we challenge? How do we to tackle the energy question? You know, how do we get off the fossil? Everybody agrees we have to get away from fossil energy because it's polluting. But how we do that? You know, how do we replace fossil with renewables, with clean energy? What is the impact of energy efficiency? So the Secretary General's energy initiative brings all these things together, stipulating that by 2030 we will have to increase energy efficiency by 50%, which is doable, which decreases, of course, you know, our energy use. It makes it easier to increase renewables in the energy mix, in the energy equation, and double at least renewables in the energy mix. All of this is doable. There are many examples how it can be done, you know. And but of course, you know, there are many questions. One of them is financing. How do we raise the money? We have the technology, you know. But how do we go on scale with the technology? How do we go on scale with energy production of renewables that we lower unit prices? How do we diffuse that, make it accessible? We have more than 2 billion people in the world today who don't have access to electricity, who burn biomass with all the effects, to your health if you burn wood in your house, and so how do we do that? And how do we provide access to energy for everybody to make sure that in African villages life doesn't stop when the sun sets, that people can go on with production, with reading, with work at home? How do we provide energy access to everybody in the face of energy efficiency and the stipulation of getting off fossil energy and replacing much of it by renewable energy? Sustainable cities, and I already mentioned that. There's a huge trend to go to cities. I've read these incredible numbers: 80 million Chinese moving to cities every year right now. And doubling of sub-Saharan African cities in the next 10 years. So how do we provide opportunities in the cities? With absent the Industrial Revolution, which has been our only answer in the past to create opportunities, to create labor, to create jobs and work. Management of the oceans, warming of the oceans is a huge impact on us, of course. And then improving resilience and disaster preparedness. So these are the 7 main issues we are dealing with in the context of Rio in 5 months from now, where we hope that through advocacy, the leaders and decision makers will recognize that they have to come to Rio, that not only sectoral ministers come, like ministers of environment, development ministers, who then have to go to the finance ministers and ask for the money to implement the decisions. So we need politicians who have a coordinating functions, heads of state and government. How do we get them to come to Rio in face of all these huge challenges, which are scary, but we have to find, Rio will be our maybe last opportunity, window of opportunity, to decide on a strategy for the next 15 to 20 years. Now, we don't have to decide all the details in Rio. That we will not be able to. But we have to set the agenda, the large parameters, so that Rio opens a new phase in which we then get together and decide on the details. The cross-cutting issues, sustainable consumption, what does this mean? Because sustainable consumption, we know that we need about 10 times more input in producing 1 calorie of meat than vegetables. So far it has worked. But if we, again our example of China, and if a few 100 million people start eating meat, which is great, and this is progress. But where do we grow the soya to feed all this pig and the beef without cutting the Amazon and extending the areas for growing soya to feed our meat? Gender mainstream and education, science and technology, all these issues there. So all of that, of course, we have to watch and have to advance, respecting all the interests of 174 countries. The green economy in the context of poverty eradication, sustainable development, the big goal of Rio +20. What does this mean, green economy, culturally? There are a lot of countries who are afraid because they know from the past that whenever we come up with a grand scheme, it's them who pay and others take advantage. So how do we make sure that we're all in the boat, that we recognize it's in all our interest that we preserve our resources, that we preserve the globe that we're living in for our children, that they know what clean drinking water is, what clean air is. These are real common goods, clean air. And those of you who live in cities that does not provide clean air, you know what I'm talking about. A patch of nature, untouched nature, that's going to be a huge asset in the future. So how do we do that? And how do we define this green economy? And how do we go about shifting resources, making resources acceptable to finance the technology which is available so it can be implemented by all the stakeholders. So I think I have talked a lot here. My last example is the Alliance of Civilization, which is a concrete UN initiative in the domain of cultural diplomacy. You know, this is dating back to 2006, the initiative of Spain and Turkey. The United Nations decided to launch this Alliance of Civilization initiative, which is meeting every year. I think it's every year, or every other year, depends. And there's always one country carrying it. And the idea of it is to do exactly what we have been talking. Bring interests together, make us understand that the world has totally changed. We cannot exclude each other anymore. Every shock hits every part of the world. Every shock originated in Wall Street hits the last corner of the world. We cannot exclude ourselves. One of the effects and the impacts of globalization is that the world has moved together. We cannot shelter ourselves. If in one part of the world, pollution is causing destruction to nature, we all suffer. And you all know about these South Pacific islands that have this, they're losing their drinking water reservoirs, and they have not done anything wrong. It is just the effect of what has been happening in other parts of the world. So respecting all our interests, means that the world has become a laboratory, where the big challenge is, how do we do it together? How do we create cooperative, comprehensive, sustainable solutions that will enable us, or as many as possible of us, to have real opportunities to realize our own aspirations, to send our children to the doctor, to school, to provide upwards mobility, clean nature, and a future that we can depend on.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Stelzer, on the one hand for scaring us, in the sense as we reflect on the tremendous responsibility that does lie on our shoulders as we enter the interdependent world of the coming, let's say, 10, 20 years. It is important that we really recognize the challenges that are there, and I think it's also important for a conversation about cultural diplomacy really to see how can cultural diplomacy perhaps contribute. If cultural diplomacy is just about persuasion or propaganda, as it was during the Cold War, that's not going to really help to tackle some of the issues that you were talking about. If it's rather about educating, enhancing, and sustaining relationships, then actually maybe it could help. If cultural diplomacy could help, let's say, do the preparatory work, get those relations good, build the understanding and trust, then when we come together, whether it's Rio or many of these other contexts, maybe it would be a little easier to actually get some results. And so I do think there's a big responsibility for the future of cultural diplomacy to try to assist. Let's strengthen these relationships. Let's build the trust. Cultural diplomacy can't necessarily solve climate change, but it can hopefully strengthen the relationships so that when we come to the table, maybe we'll be more likely to succeed at least getting some agreement. So I think it's really that weight that I also feel on my shoulders every day as we continue with the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. That's the pressure. Whether it's climate change, etc., we don't have time to waste. We can't wait until next week or next year. We have to start now. And as you're saying, a lot of it has to do with our personal lifestyles, and we really can do a lot on an individual basis. Part of it also has to do with collaboration. Unless we really collaborate and cooperate as a world, it won't work. So I really appreciate your comments, especially at the beginning of the conference, to let us know the tremendous responsibilities that await the cultural diplomacy. So I think there it's very important. I'd like to now transition and take a few questions and comments. We're running a little bit behind schedule, but I think
the first hand was up there.
Good. You have a better vantage point. So let's try to take maybe three or four together, and then you offer a response.
You do that.
Is that okay?
You give the floor.
And I saw many hands, so let's try to keep it brief, and we'll take as many as we can. Over here was first? Or?
I think the first one was over there that I saw.
Okay, if you could please stand, then that would be great. And then maybe a little closer to the mic, and hopefully we can get it on the camera. Yeah. Okay, yes?
I'm Rowenna Martinez Ulayan Tujjolu. I'm from Turkey. But I'm originally from the Philippines. You've raised a lot of salient points regarding your, UN and the problems that the UN is embroiled in, and which I have personally witnessed in the past as a UN worker. I used to work with a UN specialized agency, and I had seen how resources had been wasted in the pockets of implementing agencies, which are not very monitored very well. and that's a very sad issue. But the point is, you have posed a question about, the future. I mean, what legacy are we going to leave our children? And my point here is, we're all talking about cultural diplomacy, and then I see all the adults around us, and Mahatma Gandhi once said, if we have to achieve real peace, if we have to eradicate war, we have to start with our children, and we don't see the children. I'm an artist, and this is all I could tell to everybody. So I hope that when we go home, we should start with our children about what we are going to learn here. We should echo it not to the prime ministers or not to our presidents, but we should echo this to our children. Then maybe we can achieve a more lasting peace. Thank you.
You should take advantage of questions that you have. It's nice to get reaffirmment and to have a consensus here, but if you have questions, that might be useful, because I won't be here long. Yeah.
Who's next? Yeah, okay. I'm not sure who's next. Okay, let's go here to the left, and we'll take one from the right maybe after. Okay.
Thank you, sir. I'm from Afghanistan. My name is Mahmoud Nurzai. The challenges that you have pointed are obviously enormous, and nation states are too small to tackle these. And on the other side, you have talked about the CO2 emission, and then we have the developing countries like India and China, and they are like very stubborn in giving their role in reducing the CO2 emission. So at this stage where the conflict of interests are tremendous, where do you see the role of the United Nations in convincing all these countries to basically give up their rule and let the United Nations basically administer all these challenges? Thank you very much.
Just for efficiency, we'll take maybe one or two more. I think you've been waiting here, and then we'll go back to the back of the room, maybe for a change. Okay, please. Okay.
My name is Ryan. I'm a law and public diplomacy master's student at Syracuse University. Thank you for being here. Your comment suggested that a lot of the solutions to the problems that you mentioned could very well be based in science and technology. And we're here talking about culture, and these two areas could very much be in conflict. How do you see the reconciliation of science and technology-based solutions to these problems you posed, which may endanger current cultural values?
Maybe one more if possible, and then we'll offer the response, please, in the back. Yes? Okay. If you could turn on the mic, also you have to hit the button. Okay.
Hi, my name is Lena from Russia, communication specialist. You said that Rio Plus 20 as a conference is our ultimate dialogue, but it will also attract people who will protest against this conference and all this, globalization. So how do we bring those people on board, and how do we persuade them that this is actually our chance to unite, not to fight, and to face these global challenges together?
Thank you. Okay. I think I can take them together, the questions, pretty well. The role of the United Nations is not to administer. What we try to do is we try to advise our governments. Many of our governments come and ask us what, first of course, what would the solutions that we all, we're always trying to learn from best practices, of course. We look in what has been done, what resolves issues, and which best practices can be applied to future cases. And this is what we make available to governments. Governments will have to take the decisions in their countries, the decision makers. But very often they come and they are advised by the United Nations. That's what we try to do. So we try to help governments to understand what is in their own interest and what is available to them to face and resolve the problems they are facing. For example, in the question of inclusive development. How do we develop inclusively? This is the piece of work question. How do we provide? Every year, they publish this list of most and least peaceful countries. You might have seen it on the internet. And it's a very interesting list. If you look at this list, the countries which are most peaceful have the most integrated societies. And the countries which are least peaceful have the most fractured and the most polarized societies. So that you can read from this list. So which allows a conclusion. You know, peace and stability is intimately linked to inclusive development. If you achieve to create a society which is moderated, balanced, where people have opportunities, where people take advantage of social networks, of a social basis, you know. But you also have, this is a precondition to peaceful societies. So I think the biggest contribution to the United Nations to long to sustainable peace is not only what we do in the Security Council, in some cases, you know, which are publicized, but this permanent work in achieving sustainable development, inclusive development. Science and technology, you know, every political decision to be sound needs to be based on facts, on hard evidence. Therefore, science and technology is extremely important to us, and research. So unless we have sound research, it is very difficult to make predictions. This is why statistics is so important today. You know, our statistics department of the United Nations is essential. We cannot make predictions without having sound statistics. To improve our numbers is very important. I will give you a concrete examples. You know, 20 years ago at Rio+20, climate change was a big issue already. And the Framework Convention of Climate Change was adopted 20 years ago. But for 15 years, very little had happened in climate change. You know, it was just not on the center of UN attention. But then, you know, a report of this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the third report, came up with hard evidence which could not be refuted anymore. And this evidence was so strong, and in connection with the G8 meeting in Heiligendamm, and Tom Friedman's article in the weekend edition of the New York Times, Main Street, you know, all these things came together and suddenly created a conducive environment for the UN that our member states recognized we need to do something, and climate change was pushed in the center of the UN agenda. We had a window of opportunity. And a lot has happened. You know, it was not only a success story. We all know that Copenhagen was quite a huge issue. But in the meantime, you know, and what happened in Durban, you know, recently, really opened quite a lot of opportunities to, I wouldn't say resolve this issue quickly, but you know, to get on track towards a solution. So hard evidence is very, very important. This is why we do a lot of research, we do a lot of reporting. Many of these reports are not read by many people, but some of them are read by the people who then base the decisions upon these reports. So this is a very important issue here.
I'm from DC and I do research consulting. You mentioned capacity development and the UN's programs. It seems, given today's times, that there are so many short-term problems that governments have on their plates. And I was wondering how the UN, in terms of long-term thinking, how do you keep capacity development a priority in your programs and balance the short-term pressing issues with the long-term issues that we will be facing in 15, 20, 30 years.
I'm Gloria Edisa from Ghana. I'm the National Executive Secretary to the National Youth Employment Program. My question is, apart from trying to achieve the MDGs, what can a country like Ghana do to face the challenges you mentioned earlier?
Sorry, what?
You mentioned some challenges.
The last part of your sentence.
That what can a country like Ghana do to face the challenges you mentioned earlier?
Okay. My name is Emmanuel. I'm from University of Manchester. I PhD students in law. Actually, I'm from Nigeria originally. I'm interested when you mentioned Nigeria case as it affects corruption. You see, like you said, the problem have been commitment and compliances of some nations who are member nations of UN. Now, if we are talking about, you know, the problem of leaders siphoning money from their countries to another country, and member countries are not playing along with UN, you know, to make sure that this money, you know, are invested back in the country, especially when it has to do with money generated from resources just like the case of Nigeria. A lot of money has been generated from oil. The fact that leaders have been messing this money up. Now, what is UN doing? I know there is what we call UN Transparency Commission. And I know they have been doing a lot of work to make sure that this money are being, repatriated back to the country. Now, if we have the problem of commitment and compliance, are we not just talking about UN just, discussing, talking the issue of advocacy, diplomacy, conciliation, and adjudication? Now, I'm talking about enforcement of making sure that these countries where the money has been, taken to comply with UN resolutions. So I'm trying to look at that UN should do more work to make sure that these countries comply with the problem.
My name is Lena, and I'm from the Republic of Georgia, but I'm a doctoral student at the University of Montana here in the United States. And I have a question about, I think you would be probably a perfect person to ask. You've acted representing governments and then also non-governmental organization today. What do you think about the personal element in resolving these problems, and how do you think what the qualities probably would be perfect to approach these challenges facing the world? Or is it the right question to pose it, the agency, in your opinion? Thank you.
Okay, let me start with how do we get people implement results, like in corruption. When countries ratify a convention, like the one on corruption, they take it upon themselves to integrate this legal instrument into their national legal system. And for example, criminalization of corruption is one of the important issues there. So countries themselves will have to take care that they criminalize acts of corruption, and they will have to comply. This is not the role of the United Nations. We're not a police force. All we can do is, through advocacy, try to make countries understand that it's in their own interest to achieve some progress. And I think it's in the interest of every country in the world to fight corruption, which is ubiquitous. There's not one country in the world exempt of corruption. Some have less corruption than others. But this is an issue that we're all dealing with. So this is what countries have to do themselves, but we will help countries develop the capacities. And here we are, capacity development. This is a main issue of the United Nations. When the UN was founded, we had 55 members, and the main issue was to make sure that to prevent the world from the scourge of wars, after the trauma of the Second World War. But then, during the very first phase of the United Nations already, this mandate was extended and widened tremendously, because today we have 194 members, not only 55, and many of the countries became independent. They freed itself from colonialism. And then the new role of the United Nations was to help those countries to become members of the international global community and to help them build institutions, to link them to the world, into the trade systems, and just to help them, to build the capacity to become actors in a cooperative world, in a world as cooperative as possible. So capacity building became one of the main pillars of the United Nations, which still is. So we do this in every aspect, in every conference, whenever we have some. Like, concrete example, Rio Plus 20. We did 5 regional meetings to prepare for Rio Plus 20, to help countries in the regions understand what is at stake and how they could contribute, how they can participate in the elaboration of the Rio outcome, in the outcome document, which is going to be negotiated here in New York. So we invited the world to come up with contributions. We received 676, I think, contributions from member states, from NGOs, from academia. Out of these contributions, we forged out the zero draft, which is the basis for negotiations, which is the result of contributions from all over the world, from all different inputs. So this is also capacity building. Help understand how we can contribute and how we can participate in the solution of the problems that affect us all. What can a country like Ghana do? Every country has to have its own plan. Therefore, we work with countries and help countries to develop and to define their own national development strategies, which have to be tailor-made because every country is different. So what we do, for example, in the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals, we had a conference 2 years ago where the outcome document refers to a huge amount of actions which are possible. Now, we believe that to secure progress and results, we need 3 components. We need political will. We need strategies. And we need financing. So the most important thing is that a country recognizes that something needs to be done, that they have a problem. Like when we had the food crisis a few years ago, there are many countries which had millions of people who were starving, who wouldn't even admit that they had people who were in need, until we were able to raise money to fight the problem, and then they would come to terms and start working on own plans, national plans to resolve the issue. So the issue is political will, which is of course part of advocacy, actions, which in regard to the MDGs we have plenty. So each country needs to choose which actions can be applied best to the national individual cases, and it's the money flow. Money flow is difficult right now because we tell ourselves we're in a huge financial crisis, which is of course a perception because the world today is 60% richer than 15 years ago. In the last 15 years, global wealth increased by 60%. So it's a question of what are we doing with the money? You know, whether we could keep circulating it with incredible speeds in the financial markets, or whether we make it available for the real economy, whether banks finally come to terms with their mandate and make credits available for small and middle-sized enterprises, which are the engine of job creation, or whether we keep this money in computers and circulate tremendously without much effect to the real economy. So there's enough money, you know. The question is, what are we doing with that, you know? Are we, you know, right now everybody is talking about balancing budgets, you know, and cutting expenses, you know. We see already now, we are 2 years into this effort, and the effects we can see. There was a very interesting article yesterday in the New York Times by Krugman, you know, this very interesting to read, you know. And we know from history that you cannot balance a budget just by cutting expenses. You have to create markets. You know, you have to raise money, taxes. How can you pay for the global goods without raising money to pay for it? So you have to create markets. You have to get people to consume. People only spend money if they have money. If you cut all the expenses, you suffocate the economy, and it collapses, as we have been seeing, you know, globally right now. But still, we don't get off this track. So the United Nations is powerfully and sustainably advising our governments that you cannot balance a budget only by cutting social expenses. You know, we have to. We also advise countries that the basis for development is a just taxation system. Otherwise, the state will not raise the funds necessary to make available the common goods for the population. Personal element, this is the last question. I think it's huge. You know, for example, the United Nations, I'm totally convinced, are personality-driven. You can create the greatest position. You can have the smoothest job description. If you don't hire the right person for the job is dead. So it's very much personality-driven. You have to take the right people. People have to understand what is at stake, you know, and they have to do something. So I think person's personality is extremely important. So this is very good that so many of you came here, that you're even sitting on the floor, that enough seats. You know, this is, by the way, quite impressive that you have been able to assemble such an interested and large group to spend days dealing with issues which all concern us, but which will not give you any quick returns. But hopefully some long-term satisfaction and ideas how to contribute and how to invest your own energies in a way that you feel good about it, you know, because I think this is what it all comes down finally. You know, how do we feel at the end of the day? Have we contributed in a way that makes us feel good and where we see some positive effect? Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Ambassador Stelzer. And I walk away from this lecture not depressed, but rather inspired. And I think really what was helpful about your lecture is really painting the picture in terms of what are we up against in terms of global challenges. And to flip it, as you were implying there, it's not a matter of what can we take from the UN or what can the UN do for us, but what can we actually give to the UN? How can we work together in partnership with global governance? And I think there our role as private citizens as well as civil society is immense. And I think really that's maybe the third domain where actually the UN, I think, really could engage even more. We have Alliance of Civilizations, we have UNESCO, great, but I think civil society, I think there's a huge untapped potential in terms of really partnering with civil society at a local and a global basis. So we're hoping to continue the collaboration also with the UN in that regard, and in that sense, that's why I'm more inspired than depressed. We know that the challenges are great, but I think together in partnerships such as those collected in this room, as you pointed out, we have many more participants than we expected. When we first designed this conference, we were thinking maybe 40, 50. Now I think it's officially 130. So I think today it'll be about 105. Not everybody can make it on the first day, so it'll be a squeeze, but it's really international. I think that's the exciting thing. So I think you all really will add so much to this conference. So maybe we could do a second round of applause just to express our gratitude to Ambassador Stelzer.